So this slide is just about setting the scene as to where we are from an ESG and climate risk perspective. So the UK is actually ranked as the 17th highest in global share of CO2 emissions. So actually quite relatively low. However, UK pension assets are valued at 2.58 trillion, third largest pension sector in the world. So UK pension schemes are actually massively exposed and also in a unique position of influence in addressing ESG and climate risks. As trustees, we have to disclose financially material considerations towards ESG and climate change in our SIP. We have to publish them. If you're a DC scheme, you also have to produce an implementation statement. And that's in addition to how we encourage our asset managers to align with our ESG policies. And also, we have to ask our asset managers to describe voting behaviours, which also raises the ongoing discussion of voting if you invest in pooled funds, but that's a discussion for another day that we'll cover. And schemes over 5 billion in size from October this year will have to report on climate risks in line with the TCFD guidance. So given this responsibility as a trustee myself, I certainly want to see clear evidence from my asset managers that there's clear action being taken on ESG and climate change. For DB schemes, it's also understanding how the sponsor employers is seeking to address these climate risks, because it's also an important part of assessing the strength of the covenant. The most important aspects from all of this, I need to go back to it, is to protect the members' pension pots from ESG and climate risks. And last but not least, just to add on to all of that for us trustees, we have to think about member engagement and communication around ESG and climate risks. We're going to touch on that, why that's important later on. So as trustees, and I think just as a pension sector and ourselves, we all advocate the importance of saving into a pension scheme at an early age. However, we also need to apply the same thinking in respect of climate change. Because of those companies we invest, they need to be thinking about allocating capital to address climate risks at the earliest possible opportunity. The longer they leave it, the more challenging it will become. And this will become a massive risk to member pots. So next slide, please. So just to touch a little bit on a survey that we undertook with the PLSA last year. So looking at pension scheme members, it's not a surprise that most members are not aware of what their pension scheme is doing in respect of managing climate change risks. And because there's a lack of data, it's not a surprise that the majority of members are not aware of the carbon emitted as a result of their investments. However, as trustees, we need to really realise that people are now becoming more aware of climate risks to our planet and the impact to our everyday lives. And they will start linking this to their pension pots. And they will expect more information on how schemes are tackling climate change risks to the pension scheme. So Scott, the results to the right of this slide actually demonstrate the data challenge for trustees. So how do we tackle this?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's definitely a challenge for pension funds and its trustees to manage. And we did a PLSA survey on ESG with a range of UK pension schemes, and the results clearly show the demand for ESG data and that current sources of ESG data aren't enough. Data gaps are also clear. Getting hands on more data is needed to get started on addressing and identifying the challenges, both from an ESG and sort of climate risk perspective for the scheme. And as well as that, accessibility and transparency of that data is key to making a start on all of these really important topics. And I would just say and highlight that the ESG data and climate change data is imperfect at the moment, but the more you can get your hands on in terms of reporting, source data, and challenging your service providers for more data that your scheme needs is a great way to start. And with that data in hand, schemes, I think, are in a better position to understand their overall baseline risk from an ESG risk perspective, any potential breaches, any product involvement, and as well as that, carbon metrics that fit into that TCFD, which we're going to talk about a bit later. And once you have that baseline understanding across your portfolio as a scheme, you can subsequently begin to manage and monitor the investments at portfolio, fund, and underlying sort of holding ISIN level as well. And to strengthen that governance even further, we really believe that independent reporting can strengthen governance here as well, and that will help schemes basically create a level playing field with your asset managers when starting to collect and challenge ESG risks, exposure, and overall sort of carbon data as well. So I think the key message on that one is, certainly think big. There's a lot to manage. You've got to start small, but most importantly, make a start. And so moving on to the next slide, please. We're on the sort of forces driving change for trustees around ESG and climate change risks. And I think it's really been made clear by the TPR, things like the Paris Agreement, commentary from Guy Opperman, and UK legislative targets, all pointing to one direction of travel. And that is that ESG and climate change is here to stay. And it's something that pension schemes need to consider. It's not just a fad, and it's increasingly becoming a part of regulatory and risk management factors that must be effectively integrated into a scheme's overall governance process. If you look on the right-hand side, there's a chart there that clearly identifies the greenhouse gases emissions gap of a scenario now, sort of without any action, and scenarios with change and different levels of implementation, hitting a 2-degree target or 1.5-degree target. And certainly that gap needs to close if we want to keep in line with things like the Paris Agreement and UK government targets. And I think the challenge just got even bigger after the recent sort of G7 announcement, in which countries including the UK, the US, Canada, Japan, France, Italy, Germany announced a more stringent and ambitious target of tackling climate change in moving their policies to keep in line with a 1.5 degrees warming relative to pre-industrial temperatures. And this implies an acceleration of overall decarbonization targets by 2030 to achieve that net zero target of by 2050. And that piece will really place additional pressure on companies, bond issuers, and underlying companies to cut their emissions, decarbonize, and transition into that low carbon economy. And the risks of not doing so are certainly important to monitor. And that includes all the underlying companies within your portfolios as well. This just makes it even more clear. Sources of carbon, it's in all sectors. Trustees need to understand, the overall carbon emissions generated from their underlying investments as a part of the TCFD reporting requirements. And as the world moves from fossil fuels to renewables in that sort of energy transition, it's going to have a far wider impact on many sectors, companies, which all use, sources of energy, and the effects of this transition away from carbon-intensive sectors and overall decarbonization will largely impact the majority of our funds and the constituent holding companies within that. And so, we've seen through the scenario analysis that understanding the underlying exposure at fund, sector, and ISIN level is important. And we really need to start as an industry quantifying that risk And the best way to start is really by getting your hands on reporting and data available to you at a portfolio and sector and ISIN level.
So thanks, Scott. Really interesting, and it just shows how widespread, you know, carbon emissions are across all industries. But more importantly, how energy contributes to the total global carbon emissions. It's quite frightening, actually, and quite shocking. So given the extent of the impact of high carbon, what data is actually available, you know, on carbon emissions for trustees?
Yeah, so as I highlighted in one of the previous slides, you know, data availability, and the methodology behind that data is imperfect at the moment, but there are frameworks out there that we can start to use today to get a head start on managing and monitoring those ESG and climate risks. And so if we're looking specifically at the TCFD, you know, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures requirements, there are bold ambitions within that of embedding climate change governance, strategy, risk management considerations into a scheme's overall investment process. However, the baseline to start all of that is really to get your hands on key metrics and set appropriate targets off the back of that in relation to things like total carbon emissions, total carbon footprint, and weighted average carbon intensity scores for your portfolio and the underlying funds that you hold and underlying ISINs within those funds from a scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 carbon data perspective. And so, yeah, I think the direct and indirect data challenge, there are sort of issues with collecting direct and indirect carbon data. You know, scope 1 and 2 data is more available than scope 3 data. And certainly there are issues around data quality and availability of scope 3 data, as it's the most difficult challenge for companies and issuers to start to collect and report on. You know, it's a full sort of supply chain and sort of traceability issue for companies to understand the carbon that goes into the full life cycle of the products that they offer. And this is across all sectors. You know, it's not just from a car manufacturer or a food producer, for example, but it can even impact things like, you know, financials, where banks need to consider the sort of scope 3 emissions of their underlying investments in the companies that they issue money to. And emissions intensity can be calculated once you've got your hand on all that data, and you can start to set appropriate benchmarks and targets by industry, by sector, at a fund and portfolio level, once you get a start on collecting all that data. And so from our perspective and what we've seen so far, you know, the key challenges around varying methodologies to assess and report on that data are there, but having a sort of single source of truth report that covers your full portfolio or the full extent of your portfolios as much as possible on scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions can really give user scheme a head start and a baseline understanding of your overall sort of carbon risks and carbon metrics that then flow into the governance process that you need to start to build as a scheme as a part of managing climate change risks, and of course TCFD reporting off the back of it as well.